Make sure you guys hit the subscribe button if you guys are enjoying the content that we're throwing up. And make sure you guys hit the like button if you enjoy the video. And yeah, let's begin. All right, what's going on, guys? This is Rob, and we are back again with DC Future State and the Dark Detective. And again, I love this story. It's really, really good. It's probably my favorite thing coming out of DC Future State. Batman's the best thing coming out of DC Future State. It really is, right? Dark Detective is the best thing coming out of this. It's a really, really, really cool story. So, for those of you guys who are just now joining us, one, I invite you guys to check out our Batman playlist down in the description, where we have everything related to Batman, going all the way back to Scott Snyder's New 52 Batman run, right? So that whole playlist will basically get you current on everything regarding the character. But also, with DC's Future State, this takes place in the future. And this part of the story that we're covering right now is actually the first time that we get any real measure of a time frame as far as when this happens and so on and so forth. But in effect, Batman, or Bruce Wayne, was essentially killed, or at least believed to have been killed. And Batman was more or less out of commission. Now, as we go over this, it'll become a little more apparent in terms of what's going on, because even the first issue left a lot of mystery going on. But what you end up getting here is that with Bruce Wayne basically redonning his Batman suit, albeit a kind of makeshift version, there's a few guys who are hanging out at this port, right, the authority shipyard, and just plan on robbing it of the barrels. Right now, when they're in the middle of doing this, they're basically met by the arrival of these things called cybers, which are basically the machine versions of the magistrates' police forces, more or less, right? The guys who kind of enforce law and order depending on the situation. Sometimes the magistrate itself will get involved, but more often than not, it's usually just the cybers that kind of go out and maintain order, just because of the fact that when they're machines, one, because they're insanely durable, and two, because they're not people, you don't really have to worry about a loss of life. And so, of course, Batman ends up fending off against this cyber here, but in the process, we also jump back a little bit, right? We jump back to the moment when he was essentially shot and attacked by this Peacekeeper. Now, he's referred to as Peacekeeper number 1, which really seems to be the top dog, the person who runs the entire army of all these cybers and the forces of the magistrate. And the big question that Bruce Wayne finds himself asking here, that even he doesn't seem to fully know the answer to, is why did they kill him, right? Why did they go directly after him? How is it that the Peacekeeper knew that taking out Bruce Wayne was taking out Batman? Now, obviously, us as the reader, we know, and presumably Bruce Wayne knows on some level, that the Peacekeepers figured out that his identity was Batman, right? Now, the question is, how did they learn that? Because it's one of those things where Bruce Wayne keeps his identity under lock and key. Nobody except those that he wants to know are aware of the fact that he's actually Batman. And so if they manage to find a way or figure out who he was, then the question is how, right? How could they have possibly done that? We'll actually get the answer to that question in this particular story. But what ends up happening is that in the moment when he's shot, he basically ends up falling down into the water, only to basically see the body of what he calls a John Doe, right? We're not really given a name for this person, and this person doesn't really matter outside of the fact that the body kind of rises to the surface, and it allows Bruce Wayne the opportunity to trick the Peacemaker into thinking that this is actually Bruce Wayne's body. That and the fact that he had thrown an electro grenade, which was able to throw the Peacekeeper off, is just kind of like, okay, cool. So it looks like Batman's basically dead, the Peacekeeper is temporarily incapacitated. Now, one of the things that Bruce Wayne kind of muses about here is that once he managed to escape, that you would think that it would give him a time for reflection. And he said, nope, that's not the case at all. As soon as he was out, he immediately had to find a way to stop the bleeding and then start going down the path of figuring out who it was that did this to him and why. And so what we end up finding out is that in the aftermath of all this, with him kind of operating as a vigilante, kind of switching back to the events of what are happening right now, that what he's doing here is he's actually taking up residence with a guy by the name of Noah, and that he essentially offered his name as Jeff, right? That's really all it is. I mean, he's kind of, the first and last name that he really gives here is Jeff Marks, so we know, of course, he's operating on a fake identity. To be honest, I'm a little disappointed that he didn't use the name Matches Malone, right? That's kind of Bruce Wayne's alter ego whenever he goes underground and starts operating within the criminal community to kind of figure out what's going on and put his ear to the ground and then find a way to subvert their actions, things like that. So I'm a little disappointed in that. But Noah is one of these guys where he kind of borderlines on schizophrenia, right? He is a full-on conspiracy theorist, but not all conspiracy theorists are schizophrenics. I imagine all schizophrenics are conspiracy theorists. I don't know if that's really true or not. But the idea here is that he's one of these guys where he basically seems to have a difficult time differentiating between reality and fantasy. That he's very much caught up in the idea that like aliens are out there and they're trying to they're basically, poisoning the water to use mind control on humans. Like the kind of nonsensical conspiracy theories that you hear all the time, right? They're trying to control human beings and so on and so forth. But the place that Bruce Wayne stays is essentially the bunker, right? It's essentially the basement of Noah is really all it is. But his big mission here is to figure out what's going on, right? And what he basically says is to track the money. And the reason why is because there's 3 companies that really seem to operate around the same time that have basically made it possible for Mayor Nakano of Gotham to hire in these anti-vigilante, this anti-vigilante force called the Magistrate, and then create, give them all the tools and weapons they need to achieve their goal. And these 3 companies are Neocorp, Drafttech, and Plexitech. Now, Carl Bennington is introduced to us by way of Bruce Wayne as kind of being this guy who's been around for a long time. But in terms of DC's publication history, this is the first time we're seeing him. And the little bit of history that we do get about his character is basically this idea that he was an inept businessman, that he was effectively running his company, his family's company into the ground. But by some manner, he's now become the head of Plexitech. He's now that company's CEO. And we're not really told exactly how these dots get connected. Presumably it's one of these things where it's just a great big huge conspiracy that's going on, but we don't necessarily know for sure. But the real time frame, or the first real time frame that we get, is that these corporations didn't exist before the events of the Joker War, but now they do exist. And so of course, this is the first time that we actually have DC Future State tying to the events of what's recently been written in the Batman comics. So we know it takes place probably a few years after that, but the idea of Gotham becoming so advanced so fast and growing at the pace that it is so fast does kind of stretch the limits of credulity, but it could also be one of these things where if a colossal amount of money just started dumping into Gotham City, and it was all for the purpose of just reinvigorating or revitalizing the entire city itself, then it could happen depending on how much money and all the resources that are there. But again, we don't really have all these dots connected. We don't really know how we got from the end of Joker War to this particular situation here. Of course, as the story unfolds, we'll learn more about it. But one of the things that goes on is that Batman's really here for the purpose of just reconnaissance, right? He's actually looking to achieve a particular goal. And the reason why is because once he gets into this location, what he ends up finding is that he's immediately set upon by these little motion sensors and so on, which he's able to dodge. But it also leads to a kind of ruse, in the sense that this was basically not really a trap, but a type of security that was set up to where you had the main security front, which was, like motion sensors, things like that. Then you had backup sensors, right? You had backups for backups. And so it's one of these things where the Magistrate had always focused on the idea of maintaining redundancies. But the whole point of Batman being here is to steal one of these little tiny drones that they have, right? A little micro drone. And what he tells us, this is what's kind of interesting here, what he tells us is that this is one of these situations where it was developed by Wayne Enterprises somewhere along the line. That Wayne Enterprises is going to use it for a kind of surveillance system, right? To map the tunnels and things like that within Gotham, the little nooks and crannies, not really for the purpose of spying on people, but to try to keep Gotham, or try to figure out what all's going on below Gotham City. Now, we can largely chalk a lot of this up to like the Court of Owls story from Scott Snyder, that in the aftermath of that and Bruce Wayne coming to the realization that the Court of Owls was operating within Gotham City for, hundreds of years and Batman never knew, it probably raises the question, what else doesn't he know about the city of Gotham? And so having a kind of surveillance system that's not really designed to spy on people, but to give them a much better view of what's going on in the city of Gotham seems to make logical sense. The problem is that while he's analyzing this thing and while he's studying this thing, he also begins to realize that it has cloaking tech, right? Which means that it's probably being used within the city of Gotham and nobody really seems to know exactly what's going on. Now, of course, his entire study of all this is immediately cut to a halt when you have Noah, who comes running up on the door that Bruce Wayne locks with a baseball bat, ranting about how they've all found him, right? About how like they've been found out, they've been discovered, and like they're here, right? Presumably the magistrates and their forces. Now, in response to this, we don't really have an instance where like, Bruce Wayne and Noah end up getting into a fight. Instead, what they do is they basically put up this kind of sensor, right? This sort of siren that's designed to detect, signals that aren't supposed to be there, and then create a kind of alarming sound ever since, every time that happens. The problem is that as soon as it's there, it immediately starts going off, right? It immediately starts buzzing. And for Noah, in his schizophrenia or mental illness or what have you, he just kind of lets it ride, right? Because it basically reminds him constantly that there are forces out there constantly trying to spy on him. For Bruce Wayne, he kind of seems to run with it as well, and he's the one that sort of helps him set it up. But getting back into his thing and sort of analyzing what's going on, we end up finding out that Carl Bennington has actually been killed, right? He's basically been assassinated. And so the question at that point, it kind of turns into a murder mystery. How was this done, right? And so using the goggles of Noah that just kind of exist as regular goggles, along with tech that he got from the cyber, as well as this little mini drone, he's able to basically hack into their frequency. And when he does that, he kind of starts looking around and seeing what's going on in Gotham, only to discover that Gotham itself seems to have these little small nano drones that are completely new that are flying around the city itself. And so once he attains one of those, then it turns into breaking that one down and figuring out what's going on with this little drone. And when he finally figures that out, he starts going from different version to different version because they have these kind of beefed up security measures. The first drone he had was just kind of a small little drone that he found out there. These are more advanced and operate in a much larger number. And so it looks like what the magistrate had done had basically taken the technology developed originally by Wayne Industries, capitalized on it, seemingly improved on it, and then in turn dispersed them throughout the city. And that's exactly what turns out to be the case. That once he finally manages to access one of these drones, once he manages to break into his technology to effectively hack it, that he starts learning that all these different drones are flying around the city of Gotham. Now, one thing that does happen is that when he ends up having like one of these little surveillance devices, kind of one of the bigger ones, that manages to track him down, he of course destroys it, runs away, and then runs into the newer Batman coming out of Batman Future State, right? So he runs into that guy. It's only a small little thing. They don't actually fight each other, which would be kind of cool if they did. There's almost kind of an understanding between these two, right? And of course, neither one seems to know the other's identity, but there's kind of an understanding where it's like, okay, you know, you're Batman, like you're the old Batman, the way that it used to be. I'm Batman the way he is now, right? So they kind of acknowledge that neither one's really operating within the confines of the law, but they're both working in their own way to take down the magistrate and try to end their control over Gotham, right? And so because of that, they just end up sort of leaving. The other thing that sort of indicates here is that they may have met before. Now, we're not really given any indication like, yes, I ran into him multiple times before. But, you know, again, it's one of these things where it's kind of you stay away, I stay away. They don't really get into blows. It's not like this, you know, Future State Batman shows up and says, hey, like, stop what you're doing or I'm going to take you in, right? Because they're both essentially operating illegally. And so following that little encounter, that you end up picking back up with Bruce Wayne. And as Bruce Wayne is going through all these little, this little drone and analyzing its abilities and so on and so forth, when he hacks into the drone itself, he realizes that they're all part of a singular network. And that because they're all part of a singular network, that they are reporting back to a singular server or a series of servers. But these little things, being as small as they are and having cloaking abilities, they're basically everywhere in the city of Gotham. They're in people's homes, they're in people's bathrooms, like they're everywhere. They see everything that's going on across Gotham 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And so if that's the case, because it's supposed to be inaccessible, then Bruce Wayne rationalizes that there would probably be a few instances when they're a little sloppy, or they just kind of operate based on the idea that, yeah, these little drones are there, but no one's going to see what's happening anyway. And so using his ability to access the servers, he looks up the murder of Carl Bennington, only to find out that Carl Bennington was killed by the Peacemakers. And so when Bruce Wayne looks at that and says that he was essentially, you know, it was an attempted assassination by Peacemaker number 1 on him, that Carl Bennington has been killed by the Peacemaker, then he starts to put 2 and 2 together. And he comes to this realization that when the Peacemakers first started seizing power in Gotham, that they wanted all the technology of Wayne Enterprises that they had to use for their own ends. But Wayne Enterprises said no, they shot them down. And the reason why is because he didn't want anybody to use that technology for his own ends, you know, use it for nefarious purposes. That the surveillance technology was not supposed to be used to kind of usher in a kind of totalitarian state or a totalitarian city where whoever's controlling them has total control and authority and they spy on everybody and all that kind of stuff. It was supposed to be used more for research purposes to better understand the city of Gotham. And so because that technology, along with other forms of technology, were shot down in terms of the Peacemakers and the magistrate trying to get their hands on them, that they basically seem to assassinate Bruce Wayne. They kill him, they take over his company. That Carl Bennington, it looks like he was getting in the business of selling all this information and this technology to other people out there, and they killed him to keep that from happening. It's all being done for the purpose of just tightening their grip over the course of the city so they can make themselves an absolute ruler. Now, we don't really know if the mayor has a hand in this, or if it's a situation where Peacemaker 1 is just doing it on his own, taking the opportunity to make himself a dictator over the city, because we don't know anything about Peacemaker number 1. We don't really know what's going on with him. And so the result of this is that once Bruce starts to look around and he starts to use these goggles to start, you know, monitoring where all these things are, that's when he realizes Noah is not really crazy. That Noah putting this device on the roof, this constantly blaring this signal that ultimately his daughter ended up taking down, it was the worst thing she could have done, because this signal was keeping all the drones away. But now that signal is gone, all these drones are descending on that house. They're all aware that Bruce Wayne is there. They all know that Bruce Wayne is alive. The magistrate is the magistrate and Peacemaker number 1, they're all aware that Bruce Wayne is there. They're trying to find him. They're trying to catch him, and presumably they will, right? And so as a result of this, he ends up smashing all that technology, everything he's done. He smashed it all to pieces, and most likely he's going to go even further underground before any of these drones can find him, locate him, and try to kill him. So with that being said, guys, we're going to bring this video to an end. If you are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you drop a like, and I will catch you all later. Peace.